Um, Hello, everybody. It's wonderful to have you here today. My name is Lucy Jackson. I'm an Associate Professor of Ancient Greek Literature at Durham. And in conversation today, we are incredibly lucky to have Emily Lim, the Director of Public Acts, an organisation based at the National Theatre in London that builds sustained, crucially long-term partnerships with community around England to create, I'm going to steal your word, Emily, extraordinary acts of theatre. Public Acts started in 2017, and the first phase culminated in a beautiful production of Pericles in the Olivier Theatre. And Public Acts went on to work with their partners and communities outside of London as well on other classics, such as You Like It and Brecht's Caucasian Chalk Circle, recast as the Doncastrian Chalk Circle set in Doncaster. The most recent spectacular, truly gobsmacking performance to watch was a reworking of the Odyssey. And I don't want to talk anymore. I want to hand over directly to you, Emily, and ask you to tell us about what the Public Acts Odyssey was and is, because the whole point, as I understand it, is that this is an ongoing thing that will continue to shape people's lives. So please tell us about the Public Acts Odyssey.
Thank you, Lucy. It's really lovely to be here. You've given such a beautiful description of our project. As you said, we work across the country in partnership with community organisations and theatres. And the seed of the idea for the Odyssey came from us. It grew during COVID, and we were in the middle of working in Doncaster on the Doncastrian Chalk Circle, and for our fifth birthday was coming up. 2023 marked the fifth anniversary of the project, and we wanted to create a model of working that would allow us to tell one story and to increase our network of brilliant national organisations across the country, as well as bringing Public Acts back to the National Theatre. And we lent into the idea of journey stories, and I guess the Odyssey was in some ways something we resisted at first, because it's like it's iconic and it's one of the most obvious places that we could have gone to, an episodic journey story that had lots of really neatly chunked up sections, a big mythic universal hero story at the heart of it. So we sort of danced around some other ideas, but we ended up coming right back to where we started. And I think there was something particularly about the idea of Odysseus as the most resilient of heroes that drew us closer and closer to that story. At the time when we were dreaming it up, it was the middle of the pandemic. We were all constantly having to reinvent what that word meant for ourselves and our communities. And I think the idea of telling a story as one united national community that would allow us to excavate what it means to be resilient, both on our own and through the connection with our neighbours and our communities, felt really rich. Especially in the wake of like a world turned upside down. The Trojan War kind of came to me to be like everything we were experiencing, all of the loss, all of the grief, all of the turmoil that we were experiencing as a national community felt like it was held somewhere in the metaphor of that war. So we decided, sorry, I'm darting all over the place, but we decided to partner with 4 different organisations across the country, ranging from Sunderland in the northeast, Doncaster, Trowbridge down in Wiltshire in the southwest, and Stoke-on-Trent. And we decided to tell the story in 5 chapters. So one chapter would happen in each of those places, and then we would tell the 5th and final instalment back at the National Theatre with a community of Londoners joining together with people from all of those different 4 places. And that was the final piece of the jigsaw that happened here at the Olivier Theatre at the National, with a company of over 160 people from all across the country. My brain is still recovering from the insanity of this summer. Is that clear? Does that answer your question?
No, that is very clear, and also gives us just a sense of the intellectual depth behind it as well. This idea of the Trojan War as a metaphor for the pandemic as well is, I think, a really crucial frame for understanding how you got to this place of working with the Odyssey. And in terms of what happens now with it, it ended in this amazing production which focused on the Underworld episode, or the first Underworld episode, we can say, for the Odyssey geeks out there. What sort of has been happening since then, and how will Odysseus continue?
Oh, it's a great question. So practically what's been happening, so we finished, we rehearsed for 2 months in these 5 different locations, with an amazing team of associate artists, over sort of 25 associate artists who were leading rehearsals with all the different pods of performers across the country. And then we brought everyone together for this kind of amazing residency for 11 days at the end of August. And then we did our 4 performances. And then the day after the last performance, everybody made their own personal odysseys back to their homes. And then we have the sort of legacy part of our project kicks in. So we had a reunion a couple of weeks after we all finished. We had an online reunion. The way that we work means that no individual comes to us as a kind of individual isolated force. So everybody is linked up to their community organisation or their theatre organisation and is looked after. So everybody is looked after. There's lots of aftercare that goes on for each community member. So it's not that they've left the National Theatre and then they're right out there on their own without any tethering back to the project and the community. Everybody's sort of got lots of reunion events, and whether that's cups of tea or hookups for new projects or whatever it is, everybody continues on their journeys in different ways. But I think maybe the most important thing that I've been reflecting on is how the impact of this and then the scale of this project for people, and it's the kind of epic sweep, and the fact that we, people were performing their own shows in their hometowns, and then were coming to perform this final piece all together as part of this one united jigsaw company. It's really had a longevity in people's lives, that it's grown very deep roots. And I think when you ask about where Odysseus is going next, I sort of love that. I definitely feel confident saying that Odysseus and the spirit of this story and the ideas of resilience and hope and homecoming and connection and overcoming, which is a huge one, feel like they are in all of us who are lucky enough to be part of this amazing, caring, loving, joyful national community. It feels like the feedback I've had and we've had as a program is that people are taking all different forms of those values back into their daily lives. And whether that's someone saying, I've found new confidence and I've gone out to get a different job, or I've signed up for this this student course as a one of our older members has decided to go off to a drama course because they've don't want to stop doing it, or somebody changing their wardrobe and deciding that they feel liberated to wear sequins and glitter in a way that they didn't before. Those sorts of which some of those things sound small, but they're seismic, they're huge, and it's changing how I think our project is all about how we can by seeing potential in everyone and by adopting a kind of radically inclusive way of working together that promotes joy and care, like a culture of care. That's sort of the most important thing we do, is create a culture where people feel seen and valued and cared for and uplifted. By doing those things, you can change how we see ourselves as individuals and in relation to each other as communities. So that's the spirit, I think, that lives on, combined with the practical ongoing legacy work.
I mean, transformative really is the word that just really kind of comes out of that, and a long-lasting, sustainable transformation and ability to keep on transforming, maybe, which again makes my geeky brain think back to the very end of the Odyssey, when he has come home, but he still hasn't lost some of that habit that he has of traveling and of hiding identity. What you're describing is a much more positive kind of transformation, but still resonating there in the text of the Odyssey. So I have a broad then question sort of following up about, because the Odyssey isn't the only classic text that Public Acts has worked with, and it's not the only classic or classical text, indeed, if we think about Pericles as well as a story. What do you think it is about this combination of classic texts and a community that really seems to work? Or rather, I mean, I know that there has been some new work done with the Public Acts partner organisations, But is there something inherent about something old, a work that is old and that has been already told in various ways, that works with community participation, or maybe works against it, and that was something you had to overcome? These two things coming together, what's in the alchemy there?
I mean, I think the very early conversation that we had with you was really formative for us, where I think I said, we want to work with the Odyssey, but we want to have a very loose relationship with it. There's big sort of interventions that we want to make, and we want to play hard and fast with that as source material. And I think, I can't remember how you will have phrased it more beautifully than I can phrase it, but you said something like every act of telling these myths is an act of retelling. And so, of course, taking it as a starting point and jumping off to find contemporary resonance, to find specific meaning within these different communities across the country feels like a brilliantly appropriate thing to do with this. And you talked about how community is so inherent in the Greek stories, and particularly, I mean, when I talk about us coming to Odysseus as a symbol of resilience, but of course the idea of Xenia being right at the heart of this story, and that being something that's so guest host relationships, how we treat people we don't know, what's a culture of kindness towards strangers, how do we come to know one another, all of those are ideas that could define public acts and what we're about. So that connection between this particular story, but also ancient storytelling as a practice, and a practice that is communal and shared, the very idea of these stories being orated and passed down and taking different forms through different writers and communities, feels like it speaks so much to what we're trying to do as a community program all the time, in terms of making people feel empowered and connected through story. I think these big ones that have lasted, my theory is the reason they've lasted is because they dig deep into the human experience and into our hearts in ways that feel really universally resonant. And when we're working with companies who are drawn from such a broad range of lived experience, a very, very broad demographic, we work with 4-year-olds, we work with 84-year-olds, we work with people who have come from all over the country and who have very different politics and ideas and experiences, having a universal hook and something within which people can find themselves has proved to us extremely valuable. Pericles was a story of, of personal loss, of learning, of what it means to call a place your home. Doncastrian Chalk Circle is a lot about found family, about love, about justice, these big, and then in the Odyssey, as I say, this story of resilience, a story of journeying, of overcoming. And in our version, we were very interested in in our chapter, the last chapter, very interested in the underworld and the idea of memory and of the impact and the imprint that we leave on others' lives. Those big ideas feel like things that whoever you are and wherever you're coming from to our community, you can find something of yourself. And we've had really profound experiences of company members sharing their own stories that have nothing to do with the specific story we're telling, and yet everything to do with that story, and saying, I feel like this is my story as a mother, as a as somebody who has struggled to find a home in my life, as someone who feels very lost, or whatever it is that people have found themselves in those big stories. So I think that's important. I think there's also something that I love about the Greek stuff, and it was really special for me to do this one, because I studied classics for 4 years at Oxford, and that doesn't often, I think there's lots of my degree that does come into play in a subconscious way, but this was quite fun because I could also get really geeky on it and like write the words in the Greek alphabet in my notebook and get really geeky and hide it from other people, because then it was a bit too geeky. But I think, again, it came out in our conversation, something about how important and central and civic the idea of theatre was to Greek culture is so inspiring, and again speaks right to the heart of public acts. Like the idea of a Greek chorus is inherently public acts. It's like, whoever you are, if you're part of this community and you can sing and you dance and you want to come be part of this, you can. Or the story that you told me that I inspired our company with many times, the idea that the you'll have to correct me if I say this wrong, but that the prison, is this right, that like members of the prison community were released, put on special release for days when the theatre shows were going to be performed, because it was seen as such an important part of human experience and learning and growth and development and civic life. And that kind of status, like affording that sort of status and communality to the idea of theatre making, again, sits right at the heart of what we try to do. And I also loved telling the company, I told them this on day one of rehearsals, is it Epidauros, where the theatre is also a sanctuary of healing? Oh my gosh, that just blew all of our minds, because as a programmer, not all theatres and theatre makers are like this or prioritise this, but we certainly do. Like the idea of theatre and connection, the connection that we make through the creative act of telling stories, being something that heals and has the capacity to heal us, is so important. And I love that in Epidauros we have this like physical symbol of a space of theatre making and a space of healing being as one. And the final thing I'll say in answer to this question is that obviously the scale of, and as very personally with my aesthetic as a theatre maker and the things that get me really fired up, the scale of imagination in these stories and the bouncing between different worlds and big mythic monsters and a divine realm, and being on you're on Olympus one moment, you're in a massive sea storm the next, you're fighting a six-headed monster, the kind of theatricality is so inherent in these stories. So I think that's also something that I really responded to. I remember saying, oh yes, and I get to do the underworld, and I get to do Mount Olympus, and we get to do the mortal world. Like, this is an absolute treat. So yeah, there's so many reasons, I think, why these old stories, and particularly, as I say, what I've loved learning this time around, what these Greek stories offer us. The difficult thing, actually, though, just to add, I do think there's, with our programme, we don't shy away from darkness, but we're not in the business of doing like bloody tragedies. So we, and that's a thing. Like when you talk about things that you maybe move away from, we 100% moved away from the bloodbath in Ithaca at the end. And
well, I was going to say, I think that does lead us on quite nicely to another question that I had about. I mean, you were very frank about the way that you were approaching the source material. There were some big changes, or you were working with, in a very robust way, the source material, and there were things that you just didn't want to engage with, as you said. I mean, you absolutely said basically the second half of the Odyssey, no, not gonna deal with that. How, I suppose, talk us through that process of choosing the things that you wanted, and if any of those other sort of harder conversations found their way into the process anyway, because like you say, there are a lot of big feelings, big emotions, even and especially in the parts that you were dealing with, death being just one of them. I suppose, how do you feel about really taking a sharp bladed adze to the Odyssey, and where you chose to focus on?
I think it's worth naming as well the first 4 episodes, which were directed and written by different teams of brilliant artists across the country. Chris Bush, the sort of lead dramaturg and the writer of episode 5, she and I made the decision about which chapters to pull out and to offer to the 4 communities, and that was a kind of process of going, what feels like it has most promise here as a starting point for people, and I think the honest answer is we could have gone with like Circe instead of the Island of the Sun, or we could have gone with, I think the things that we chose, we chose episode 1 was the Lotus Eaters, episode 2 was the Cyclops, episode 3 was the 4 Winds, and episode 4 was the Island of the Sun and Helios and the Catalan. And I'm sure that we could have chosen, like I say, made different choices, and they still would have lent themselves really nicely. But we spent a few days in a studio kind of kicking around the story and thinking, what's going to offer loads of promise to our writers, and what will allow us to like keep a really clear spine. And we felt like Circe as a character and a function in the story, we sort of ended up combining Circe and Calypso, and having Calypso as a key character, one of the key characters in episode 5. So we did some of the sort of what dramaturgically and in terms of story structure, what does Odysseus need, and how might we like fill it and kind of blend things to mean that we have 5 chapters that feel like they give us an interpretation of this story that holds. And And then those 4 writers all went on their own journeys of really thinking about how the original connected to their current moment with their communities. And there were some beautiful things that came out, like in the Cyclops, they ended up, it was set in a sort of Amazon style warehouse, and one of our company members, her partner, works in a cardboard box packing factory, so it became a box packing factory, and it was essentially, the Cyclops was the factory owner, the despotic factory owner, and the whole story led towards the kind of revolution from the factory workers overthrowing the rule of the Cyclops, but inspired by Odysseus. And in episode 3, which was the 4 Winds, it was in Trowbridge, which has a very strong ex-veteran community and veteran community. And they ended up telling, Flo, the writer, told this beautiful story from the perspective of one of the Odysseus's crewmates, and who was a white working class person from Trowbridge, man from Trowbridge, and there was a really brilliant exploration of leadership and trust, and he'd been recruited by Odysseus to be part of his crew, and it was a lot about the repercussions of what happens on Andy, the character's family, and so on and so forth. So they all found really clever ways of connecting the source material to their immediate community's experiences, and asking the question, what is a hero here? What does this hero offer us? What does the idea of being a hero now present, both in terms of opportunity and challenge? A lot about distrust of power came up through all of them. Anyway, so there, and then in terms of our episode, I think some of it's also really practical. So we needed to do a 90-minute show that went straight through without an interval, and we needed, I think the axing of the Ithaca section at the end was partly about avoiding a bloodbath and wanting to have a story that felt ultimately hopeful. It was also very practical and needing to find some way of filleting. And I think I was just really struck by something I read that described the Odyssey as 2 Odysseys. It's Telemachus's Odyssey and it's Odysseus's Odyssey. And so we really zoned in on episode 5 on the relationship between Odysseus and Telemachus. And we decided quite early on we wanted to regender Odysseus. So Odysseus became a female warrior, a queen in our version, and that mother-son story became the heart of the lens through which we then kind of viewed the original and helped us pull out what we wanted to serve that story. So like a very key part of the original, which Chris was very passionate about keeping in, was Odysseus telling the story of the plough, which I didn't know, but the idea of her never wanting to go to war and feigning madness and then having to, when the maid puts the baby in front of the plough, and the plough, Odysseus calls for the plough to stop so that Telemachus isn't run over, and in that moment reveals that she isn't actually mad, and then she has to go to war. Have I done a terrible job of telling that story? But
no, exactly right.
Yeah. So that became a really important part of the original, to keep as a reflection on how she is a mother and a new mother. I think there was a detail, that Chris gave in, that she hadn't weaned the baby. Details in building the picture of this female warrior and the things that she was dealing with, and the way that she was viewing her leadership versus her mothership were very interesting and important. And I think I personally, a lot of it does also come down to personal taste and the things that you personally respond to. I have always been really affected and moved by that scene in the underworld where the dead swim forward and around, and where Odysseus meets his mum and Achilles says that very important line about, I would rather be a serf in the land of the living than was it a prince or a king or a lord or whatever it is in the land of the dead. And so we wanted to spend more time with those ideas. So the back end of our play became about her experience in the underworld, and it became a kind of meditation on and a reflection on what it is to be remembered, and the power of memory and the power of love. But the biggest challenge, the thing that got raised most was Penelope, because we didn't have a Penelope, and I think that was the one that came up as being most gently controversial, I suppose. And one of the I think it was the writer Lindsay, our brilliant writer of episode 4, struggled with the idea that a character who's already pretty silent in the original was being further silenced, in fact completely sort of eradicated from the story in our version. And Chris and I talked a lot about this, but we ended up, again, partly because of economy of time and things like that in terms of the storytelling, we decided to hold the female, to sort of do almost like blend aspects of the original Odysseus with the original Penelope and have those come together in this single mother character of Odysseus, the warrior queen.
I was thinking that was very much in the discussion, certainly in the production, which I was lucky enough to see, the focus on the mother-son relationship, that I did find myself constantly thinking about the relationship between Penelope and Telemachus in the Odyssey, and the difficulties there, the tensions that are there as well, with Telemachus still wanting to stretch away to find this person, and still sort of having that very important sense of home that is buried in the figure of Penelope. I think those themes did somehow end up coming out. Do you have a sense about why people were, or certain people were kind of keen for Penelope? I'm just very aware that we're in a moment right now of Greek myth retelling, and especially from the female point of view. Did that fit into it in some way? What was the sense of Greek myth outside of your Odyssey that the co-creators, that the community members themselves were bringing in with them?
Sorry, just what? So, in terms of how sort of aware were we of and how important was the broader context of reception of Greek myth and reworking of Greek myth at the moment?
For you and for people coming in, what did people bring with them, I suppose, of Greek myth, if any?
Yeah, interesting. A lot brought nothing. A lot brought like, what? Who? Odyssey, which is really exciting. Some, like our wonderful company member Tony in Stoke, is a mad ancient Greek story buff and knew everything. Yes, and I think there was an awareness. I think that's why people asked about Penelope, because I think with some people there really was an awareness of how what a hard time the women have had, and how we want to like correct that, right, and be on the right side of like right side of that. I read the Penelope ad and had a really good time reading that, and interestingly, I think that sort of, I don't know how much that coloured, and my knowledge of some of the wider brilliant work that's been done, maybe made me feel also like it's cool. Like people are doing loads of interesting stuff about Penelope. Like I didn't feel a responsibility with this interpretation. I also don't think she is silent in the original, but anyway, yeah, I guess it was a mix. People were bringing a mix of things to the table. But it's also worth saying with this particular project, the story is it's a very, very important, it's a central part of it, but it's one part of a huge tessellation of things that are going into the big mixing bowl, and the kind of how we deliver on our values, and the huge like jigsaw, the map of how we're bringing together our partners and who we're working with and what their experience is going to be, and how we build the show working in 6 different rehearsal rooms across the country. Those sorts of, I always say that the logistics are the art with this project. So there were also things like we had a much shorter time to develop the script, because you have to lock off the script much earlier so that you can then disseminate all of the learning to all of the associate teams so that everyone can be prepped and then start to rehearse separately. It's such a different way of working to having all of your company in the room with you all the time and being able to keep developing the script as you go. So I think there's also a certain kind of amount of pragmatism that comes with it, and we kind of have to make some decisions, roll with them, and they might, there might be decisions that you would have in a normal theatrical writing process. Maybe you might have had the luxury of being able to spend even more time thinking about them, and you might end up going a different way. But I think we were very happy with where we ended up and felt quite at peace with, as I say, Odysseus as this female single mother character, feeling like she held a lot of the really interesting things that you see in Penelope's relationship with Telemachus in the original. anyway, like their unbreakable bond, and you know, and the complexities that they ride through in that too. It's not, nothing about that is straightforward as well, right? And his kind of pull between his responsibility to her and his wanting to stretch out on his own. I think a lot of that absolutely came through in Chris's writing of the last episode.
Well, and also a little shout out for Athena in your production in the Hades episode. Athena, who takes on the role of a nurse, who's really quite involved in Telemachus's upbringing, teaching him multiple languages. I thought that was such a beautiful element and such a beautiful character actually that was created in performance there. There were sort of opportunities for fragments of the story and elements that you, for, as you say, for logistical and pragmatic reasons, could still filter in and sort of work with those themes. That was very clear to me anyway in that one.
Yeah, I loved what we did with Athena. I think getting geeky on it, there somebody made the point to me, which I think was a really good point, that Athena is a kind of surrogate mother, only goes so far in terms of how it works on us emotionally as an audience, because of course the same goddess who we're seeing looking after Telemachus, the baby, and being his surrogate mum while Odysseus has gone off to war, is the goddess who moments before has had the line in our script. She's talking to Hermes and he says, do you know about the war? The war's coming. And she says, you only make, I make the news, little brother, you only bring it. And she says it with a kind of smirk and a pride. And this idea that this is the goddess of war, this is somebody who has had agency and knowledge of the extreme levels of destruction that are about to unfold, has sent Odysseus, is part of the reason that Telemachus's mum has to go to war, and has that kind of godly distance from everything that's happening in the mortal world. Us as an audience needing to then find a real meaningful connection between her and the baby that's been left behind is complex. Do you know what I mean? Because she's playing two things, which, and I thought that was a really great provocation that, you know, and I think we just began the dance with that. I don't think we properly unfolded what that duality is of being both in the divine world as a goddess of war and being in the mortal world as a caregiver. But maybe that's also, I guess that is also like a constant theme, isn't it, of those ancient stories, is how the gods navigate their feelings for the mortals. And that, so maybe that's also really lovely that we just sort of hinted at that.
Well, as you say, I mean, it mirrors your Odysseus's relationship with her son. That's, you know, she is off doing war, and war isn't what she knows, and she is wreaking terrible havoc and murder and slaughter everywhere, and also at the same time has these caregiving feelings. That in itself is perhaps working a feminist angle that Penelope in her traditional role perhaps never could.
Yeah.
I think the tensions that you bring out there are so true. I'm aware, particularly because of the way that some of the marketing for the Public Acts productions is done, there's a lot of emphasis on the joy, on the collaboration, on, you know, warm and fuzzy feelings about how people's lives have been changed through the process of working with this story, with working with the multiple stories. But there is sort of within that, and we maybe kind of hinted at it, there is a tension about what it takes to make this kind of work. Not just necessarily for you personally, because I'm sure it is, just thinking about the logistics gives me a headache. But in terms of the kind of the harder politics involved underneath, that this is not something that we might see fitting into a traditional mold of making money in the theatre. That this has a different set of goals, and that in some ways that there have been some hard battles fought to create this kind of work. And so I just wanted to give a little space as well to talk about the politics of public acts, and I suppose kind of give a chance to talk about the radical side of it. Radical is a word that's been used in interviews, but tell us about the politics and perhaps anything that specifically came out of the Odyssey.
I mean, I think it's fair to say that Rufus Norris, a brilliant artistic director of the National Theatre, who is really the reason the program exists. He sort of put wind in our sails and gave me the space to develop the program 7 years ago and to grow it to this point. I think his giving of the keys to the National Theatre's main stage and all of the resource that comes with that to platform this work and put it right on the centre stage, and to treat it as a piece of professional theatre and to afford it all of the incredible internal resources, from the access to the costume department, to the production teams, to the stage crew and the stage time, a full proper tech schedule, all of those kinds of things. That is really radical. It shouldn't be, but it is. The kind of standing up for this work and saying that work that is made in partnership with community in this way matters as much as work that is made with purely professional companies and work that is more commercial. I think in the current moment that we're in, and I should also acknowledge, it's very important to me to acknowledge that Public Act stands on the shoulders of many other extraordinarily brilliant community activist theatre makers in this country and all over the world, and particularly the public works program that's run in New York, from whom we've done a lot of our learning. In the current climate, with the theatre industry in such a difficult moment of financial crisis, this work needs to be fought for more than ever. And again, this coming now feels really important. And for the National Theatre to be doing this work sends a very strong message, I think, to other theatres to give, and this is what we hear, this is the feedback we hear from people, is how important it is as a statement of intent and a gesture of support for community practice around the country, to know that the National Theatre is waving the flag for it. It gives other theatres the kind of wind in their sails to keep going, and other community practitioners to keep going. I think there is something soft and fuzzy and also acute and urgent and sharp and essential about the idea of people being seen, and people who have often been pushed to or have found themselves on the margins of society or excluded from mainstream culture or whatever it is, being brought right into the centre and being told your story, your voice, your image matters, you are the most important thing. That's really, that can be read as fuzzy, and that can also be read as extremely potent. And I think in our world, there's nothing more important than people coming together and being given the space to take up space. And when we talk about transformation, I talk very much about, and I think I feel confident after this process, and particularly with Odyssey, in talking about transformation, because all of us, so many of us have used those words of our own experience through the project, working with the amazing community of artists and humans we've worked with. But it's very much about people owning that transformation themselves. It's not that we change anybody's lives, it's that we give people the conditions and the space to come into a community, and then that experience catalyzes or allows them to catalyze change in their own lives. Like that's the way around. That feels, it just feels important to name that, because a lot of the project's about agency. I think our community partners before have fed back to us how what our project does is give people agency over their own lives, and people who have in some cases been forced into a position of quite a lot of passivity, or who might be used to having things done to them, are able to really feel the effect of contributing and giving and being part of something. The idea of being part of something bigger than yourself, again, can sound like quite a soft thing. Is also like the most sort of gut-punching, strident and important thing that you can experience, I think. The idea that we must, the only option we have is to come together, is to find common ground, is to celebrate common humanity, is to figure out how we do things and work shit out together. Like that, I think, is sort of the only option we have. The project is inherently uncynical, and I also see that as very political in this moment of our country and our politics. And we talk about the importance of radical joy. And again, I would say joy shouldn't be radical, but for many people and in many situations, it is deeply radical. And putting that first and finding ways that people can re-see their possibility through being in such positive community with other people is sort of everything. So yes, I've kind of given two answers there, I think, but there's something.
I mean, I kind of want to continue this with a sharper eye, just in light of our audience, with classics in particular, because that is something that can bring with it a great deal of well, some problems about power, the use of power, questions of ownership and authority and access, and a lot of the themes that you're talking about, really kind of taking this lack of cynicism to heart, allows people to just take it. It's theirs. Why wouldn't it be theirs? And I think there's something very, very inspiring in taking this approach in an uncynical way. I mean, one can always think about, well, you know, it's because the National Theatre put their stamp on it that allowed this process to happen. But I think it's really important to see how the process, which perhaps has nothing necessarily to do with ancient Greek or classics, can act as a kind of template in a way for how communities can take ownership of things that have held great power, that have held great authority. I mean, I don't know if you got a sense in the rooms about people feeling like that the Odyssey wasn't for them, that this was about something else, or what it was that made people feel so happy and easy to claim it as their own.
I think it's a lot about how people are invited to identify with the space, and I think you're so right. And the kind of broader picture here is about access to culture, and is about the idea that these institutions, this concrete behind me, which can be very intimidating and feel like very exclusive and very full of power, cracking that open and say, you know, on the first day of rehearsals, we bring everyone in and I'm like, this is the National Theatre, this is your National Theatre, this is your creative home. And that, you know, that couldn't be more true. And when we put a company of national community members on that stage and allow them to take up that space, that's just a symbol for what this building is and should be, right? And for what all our country, especially ones that are partly funded by the taxpayers, like, this is yours, these are the people that should be owning this space. So I think I think there's something about the terms that people are invited with our project to see, they're invited to see themselves as artists and to see themselves as artists who should be here. And the amazing thing about this building was how at home everybody made, you know, we put a huge amount of work in as a program to make sure that the moment that our company step through the doors, they are made to feel welcome and like they belong here. So I think there's a lot about belonging. And yes, I think, you know, it's one of the things people have commented most on with our company was there were 7 wheelchair users in our company, and that's a kind of unheard of thing, and that's shouldn't be, but it is. And having us, it's such a privilege to have the opportunity to direct the resource of the National Theatre towards making that kind of a community be able to come together and take up that space. But yes, at its heart, access to culture, and again, pulling back to the Greekness of it and just going, that's exactly what theatres in, you know, they were a function of democracy. And the fact that the Olivier Theatre where we performed here is so based on the architecture of an amphitheatre, of a Greek amphitheatre, was gorgeous. And again, we talked to the company lots about that. And I just think the spirit of that, the civic centrality of theatre, that's exactly what theatres were designed to be. And theatres were not designed to be things that felt like they held power and held access to culture with locked gates. It was the opposite, and everybody should feel like they're invited in. And if art is about holding up a mirror to our world, then it only has a future if we continue to find ways to make sure that the people who are reflected back on us are genuinely representative of our communities and of our shared experiences.
Yeah, I think it's something really beautiful that did come out that compels maybe the classicists in the audience to go back to these texts that we think that we know very well and examine them again with fresh eyes to see something about access and who is being represented actually in there. And that's work for us to go and do. But I think that's a really beautiful point to end our conversation. I want to thank you again so much for taking the time and for allowing me to push on all of the things that I found so brilliant and exciting about the production myself, and I'm sure many others who are listening now do too. So once again, thank you, Emily, for being with us today, and goodbye, everyone. Thank you very much for being part of the conversation.